What if I told you that in May 1943, 240 German submarines were already dead? They just didn't know it yet. Admiral Dönitz commanded the largest U-boat force in history, 240 operational submarines, crews who had terrorized the Atlantic for 4 years, men who believed the ocean was theirs. But while they hunted beneath the waves, something above the surface had evolved, something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't escape. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late for 28,000 of them. This is the story of how technology made an entire fleet obsolete overnight, and the men who discovered it the hard way. On 24 May 1943, Dönitz issued an order that would reshape naval warfare forever. He was withdrawing the U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic convoy routes, surrendering the only arena where Germany could still wound the Allies. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a confession. The Atlantic was lost. But this isn't a story about calculations or strategic clarity. It's a story about a man discovering that his greatest advantage had become his deadliest vulnerability. The month before, the Allies had achieved something impossible, a 7-to-1 kill ratio in their favor, reversing a 3-to-1 ratio that had favored submarines just 6 months earlier. 41 U-boats destroyed in 30 days, 1/4 of Germany's entire operational submarine force erased. The weapon wasn't new, the crews weren't inferior, the tactics hadn't failed. The Germans had simply been blind to a revolution happening above their heads, a technological shift so profound that experience itself became meaningless. Veteran commanders with 100,000 tons of sinking credits died at the same rate as new officers. The ocean, their domain for 4 years, had become a graveyard. This is the story of Black May, the month when the hunters became the hunted, when one man's personal tragedy forced him to confront a strategic catastrophe he couldn't understand, couldn't stop, and couldn't survive. It's the story of how wars aren't always won by the side with superior numbers. They're won by the side that sees tomorrow coming before it arrives. 3 weeks before Dönitz's withdrawal order, the hunting grounds looked as they always had. The waters south of Greenland had been sanctuary, the air gap, a stretch of North Atlantic where Allied aircraft couldn't reach, where U-boats converged in wolf packs to encircle convoys and sink them at leisure. For 2 years, this space had been Germany's advantage. Dönitz measured victory in tonnage. Convoys meant prizes. But while ONS 5 departed Liverpool, an ordinary slow convoy, 43 merchant ships loaded with fuel, ammunition, and supplies, no one knew it would become a test of everything the old Atlantic War assumed about survival. The gap wasn't what it used to be. Allied radar, ASV Mark III, mounted on long-range Sunderland and Halifax aircraft, now penetrated the 600 miles that used to guarantee safety. The Allies had closed what Dönitz couldn't even see was closing. The Germans attributed their mounting losses to unknown causes, writing them down in real-time war logs with a confusion that would prove fatal. One boat after another reported mysterious explosions with no attacking ship visible. No one understood they were being hunted by weapons that operated deeper than any submarine could dive. The breakthrough wasn't military, it was technological. Allied radar detection ranges had tripled, but worse than the technology itself was what came next: a system. Captain Peter Gretton commanded Escort Group B7, and he'd implemented something revolutionary. Instead of defending the convoy passively, he detached aggressive destroyers to hunt submarines actively, independently, while the main escort held position. The support group tactic meant U-boats no longer faced a single layer of defense, they faced organized hunter-kill teams with fresh crews and single purpose: search and destroy. The U-boat commanders didn't know this yet. They saw only an ordinary convoy. They assembled their wolf packs, they positioned themselves for the attack. By 4 May, they would discover that everything they understood about Atlantic warfare had become obsolete. The hunters were about to meet something they couldn't understand: their own extinction. Between 4 and 6 May, convoy ONS-5 became the pivot point where the Atlantic War reversed direction. What unfolded wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was a collision between two different eras of naval warfare, and the old era died in hours. 13 merchant ships from ONS-5 fell to U-boat torpedoes. By every historical standard, this should have been a U-boat victory, except the convoy destroyed 7 submarines in return: U-125, U-168, U-438, U-531, U-575, U-630, U-638 sunk in 72 hours. The numbers announced themselves like a prophecy. For the first time in the Atlantic War, an escort had killed more submarines than they'd lost ships. The mathematics of commerce rating had flipped. The convoy's Commodore's log documented something that would have meant nothing to Dönitz, but everything to the submariners present. Merchant crews witnessing U-boats exploding underwater from Hedgehog attacks. Hedgehog wasn't a depth charge. It was a projector that fired contact-fused mortars ahead of an escorting ship, detonating on U-boat impact. The psychological effect was profound. For 4 years, submarines had operated in darkness, invisible, untouchable. Now they could be hunted, watched, killed while you watched. The ocean's silence was being shattered by Allied eyes and technology. But ONS-5 was only the beginning. The real reckoning came 2 weeks later. On 19th May, the wolf packs gathered around convoy SC-130. They were still confident, still believing that wolf packs meant safety in numbers. They would discover otherwise in hours. 5 more U-boats were destroyed: U-304, U-381, U-418, U-436, and U-954. Among the crew of U-954 was Peter Dönitz, naval lieutenant, serving aboard his father's submarine fleet. The admiral's youngest son died with his boat in the North Atlantic. No telegram reached Dönitz immediately. He learned the news during a war conference, facing tactical reports that made no sense, casualty figures that defied explanation, and a personal loss that erased the distance between his role as commander and his role as a father. The archive of individual U-boat fates reveals a pattern that German intelligence never deciphered. 15 of the 41 May losses came from the Mark 24 Fido acoustic torpedo. It was revolutionary in its conception, a homing torpedo that pursued sound. Once dropped from aircraft, it searched for the acoustic signature of a submarine's engines and detonated on contact. The Germans had no defense. Diving deeper, the traditional escape became a death sentence. Acoustic homing works at any depth. The U-boat captain's final signals, recovered from archived war logs, describe the moment with haunting precision: mysterious explosions with no visible attacker. No ship on the surface, no approaching aircraft, just the signature of a torpedo they'd never detected, couldn't evade, and couldn't counter.
What made Fido devastating wasn't just effectiveness, it was incomprehensibility. For months, German engineers couldn't determine what was destroying their boats. The war logs show officers and command staff attributing losses to bad luck and exceptional enemy air coverage. They were describing a technological revolution without naming it, witnessing their own obsolescence without understanding it. The cruelest fact emerged from the archive: experience meant nothing anymore. Veteran U-boat aces who had sent 100,000 tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor died at identical rates to inexperienced commanders. Rank disappeared as a factor. Cunning proved useless. The war had become something pure and impersonal, technology against technology, with human skill reduced to irrelevance. Admiral Dönitz had built the U-boat force on a single belief: superior seamanship and tactical brilliance could overcome any obstacle. He had made that belief legendary. By May 1943, he was watching that legend dissolve in a month. The men he commanded, the officers he trained, the submarines he'd invested years assembling, all became casualties of a war his intelligence apparatus had failed to recognize was happening. The tactical revolution unfolding in the North Atlantic had no parallel in naval history. It was the first successful implementation of network-centric warfare, decades before anyone would name it. What the U-boats were encountering wasn't a single innovation, it was a system. And systems, unlike weapons, can't be countered by courage or experience. At the center was Bletchley Park. British codebreakers had broken the Enigma codes and were reading U-boat signals in real time. The Admiralty could see the Wolfpack formations assembling, watch the attack orders spreading across the fleet, and route convoys away from concentrations while simultaneously directing support groups toward the submarines' positions. This intelligence capability gave the Allies something unprecedented: omniscience. The support groups themselves represented a tactical reorganization that the U-boats had no doctrinal answer for. Instead of scattered corvettes and destroyers attached to individual convoys, the Royal Navy deployed specialized hunter-killer teams, fresh crews, intensive training, single-mission focus. These groups operated independent of convoy defense, roaming the operating areas with calculated aggression. Admiral Sir Max Horton, commanding Western approaches, had built a machine designed to do one thing perfectly: find and destroy submarines. The coordination was scientific. Once a U-boat was detected, either through radar contact or intercepted radio transmission, the system could calculate position within 20 miles and have aircraft overhead within 4 hours. 20 miles of ocean, 4 hours of vulnerability. For submarines designed to operate in invisibility, this compression of time and space was lethal beyond measure. The German command structure, still organized on 1918 concepts of submarine warfare, had no tactical doctrine for this kind of organized, technology-driven hunting. U-boat captains trained to evade escorts, interpret sonar, and navigate by stars suddenly faced detection methods they couldn't perceive and weapons they couldn't escape. The most damning fact hidden in Clay Blair's research: German scientists had actually developed radar detectors, the FUMB-B, that could have warned U-boats of approaching aircraft. Bureaucratic infighting delayed deployment until after Black May. Germany lost the Atlantic not because they lacked technology, but because their institutional structure couldn't recognize or adapt to the technological revolution happening in real time. The Allies didn't just have better equipment, they had a system that could think faster than the enemy could react. On 19 May, when U-954 sank with Peter Dönitz on board, Dönitz was conducting a war conference focused on explaining the unexplainable. The casualty reports had accumulated into a catastrophe. The loss rate wasn't slowing; if anything, it was accelerating. His staff offered calculations and theories: bad weather, concentrated enemy air patrols, unusually aggressive escort formations. None of it explained the scale. None of it justified the monthly total approaching 50% losses if the trend continued another month. The mathematics were apocalyptic. The moment Dönitz learned of Peter's death, the strategic conversation collapsed into something personal. His own son, commanding officer aboard a modern U-boat, had still been unable to survive these waters. This wasn't about Dönitz's feelings. Accounts from his staff documented only his expression hardening, his voice steady, as he absorbed information that transformed everything. If a modern submarine, captained by his own son, couldn't survive these waters, then no submarine could. There was no tactical improvement, no operational adjustment, no crew training that could answer this equation. The Admiralty's own official historian, Stephen Roscoe, would later document the mathematical inevitability. May 1943 wasn't just a crisis, it was the intersection where German strength met Allied capability and was crushed. The Germans had increased their U-boat operational numbers to a wartime peak of 240 submarines. They had the numbers, they had the experience, they had the doctrine. And it meant nothing against a system designed specifically to counter them. Dönitz ordered preparations for withdrawal on 23 May. On 24 May, official orders went to all U-boat command stations. The boats were to abandon the North Atlantic convoy routes. Germany's greatest strategic asset in the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat, was being withdrawn from the battle. The order itself was documented in the BDU war logs with a clarity born of defeat, not strategic calculation. Operational blindness had finally been replaced by unwilling clarity. The Atlantic was lost. The only question remaining was how many more crews would die proving it. The final numbers accumulated like a requiem for the Atlantic U-boat force. 41 submarines destroyed across May 1943. 21 died in direct convoy battles in the North Atlantic. Another 20 vanished in the Bay of Biscay and other operating areas. Together, they represented 25% of Germany's entire operational submarine force, not damaged, not captured, not repaired and returned to service, destroyed. The Bay of Biscay had become its own slaughter zone. Allied aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III radar now patrolled the German U-boat transit routes systematically. Submarines attempting to reach the Atlantic had to cross this gauntlet, and increasingly, they weren't making it across. The water depths exceeding 3,000 meters now held their wrecks scattered across the seabed, a graveyard extending from 45 degrees north to 55 degrees north latitude between 20 degrees W and 40 degrees W longitude. The human cost was irreplaceable. Approximately 1,500 highly trained submariners had died in May alone. These weren't conscripts or recent conscripts. They were personnel with years of training, irreplaceable expertise, and knowledge encoded in their actions and decisions. U-boat crews required months of specialized instruction. That pipeline could be rebuilt eventually. The experience couldn't. The bonds of seasoned crews couldn't. The institutional knowledge couldn't. By contrast, Allied merchant shipping losses had dropped dramatically. 58 ships totaled 299,000 tons, significant, but fundamentally sustainable. The Allies could build replacement shipping faster than U-boats could be constructed. They could train new crews faster than submarines could be manned. The equation of the Atlantic War had inverted. On 5 May alone, 4 U-boats had been sunk within 12 hours. Extrapolate that loss rate across 6 months, and the entire German submarine force would have been eliminated. The force didn't face 6 months. It faced withdrawal. Dönitz recognized that continuation meant annihilation. The choice wasn't between victory and defeat anymore. It was between organized retreat and complete extinction. The May 1943 withdrawal was Germany's confession that it had lost the Atlantic. The U-boat, the weapon through which Germany believed it could isolate and defeat Britain, had been overcome. The long war was no longer winnable. Dönitz's withdrawal order rippled through the U-boat command structure with a finality that even veteran submariners couldn't have anticipated. For 4 years, the Atlantic had been the strategic center of gravity, the arena where Germany could impose costs that threatened Britain's survival. Abandoning it wasn't tactical adjustment, it was strategic concession. The official documentation preserved in the BDU war logs shows the order expressed with military precision but emotional emptiness. U-boat losses have reached an intolerable level, Dönitz wrote. 4 words that contained the collapse of a strategy. His staff had no tactical solution because no tactical solution existed. They were confronting not a battle they were losing, but a category of warfare that had evolved beyond their capacity to comprehend. What followed in the days after the withdrawal order was a secondary catastrophe, the integration of losses into broader operations. U-boats were redirected toward the Arctic, toward the Indian Ocean, toward operations in the Mediterranean. Some were relegated to transport duties, others to training roles. The force that had represented Germany's last plausible path to victory was being repurposed for strategic insignificance. The German command's fundamental blindness persisted even after defeat. The Enigma codes had been broken. yet German intelligence believed them secure. The Mark 24 Fido torpedo existed and was known to German scientists, yet the Navy attributed losses to causes they imagined rather than investigated. The technological revolution was visible in casualty lists, yet the command structure insisted on explanations that preserved the comforting fiction of tactical failure, rather than accepting systemic obsolescence. Dönitz himself never fully accepted the nature of the defeat he was witnessing. In his memoirs, written after the war, he would continue attributing May's losses to bad luck and exceptional enemy concentration, unable or unwilling to acknowledge that his understanding of submarine warfare had become irrelevant. The Allies hadn't just won battles. They had won the war between technologies, between doctrines, between old assumptions and new realities. They had won with 4 hours of notice and a system nobody had seen coming. They thought massed submarines could strangle an island into submission. By May 1943, Germany had its largest U-boat force in the water and still lost the one battle it could not afford to lose. What seemed like the peak of U-boat power became in 30 days the proof that the entire concept was now outmatched. The numbers left no room for illusion. 41 U-boats destroyed in a single month, roughly 1/4 of the operational submarine fleet gone, including boats and crews that had taken years to build, train, and harden in combat. Around 1,500 trained submariners lost, men whose experience could not be replaced by simply assigning new officers to freshly built hulls. Against that, 58 merchant ships and 399,000 tons of Allied shipping were serious but survivable losses for economies that could replace ships faster than Germany could replace U-boats and crews. The exchange rate that had once made commerce raiding attractive now made continued operations suicidal. For the Allies, the impact went beyond statistics. With the North Atlantic convoy routes effectively secured, the steady buildup of men, tanks, fuel, and aircraft for the eventual return to Western Europe became a realistic project instead of a calculated risk. The Battle of the Atlantic had always been the prerequisite for any invasion of the continent. May 1943 marked the moment that prerequisite was finally decisively met. From this point onward, U-boats remained a danger, but no longer a strategic veto. For Germany, the withdrawal from the North Atlantic was more than a setback. It was the quiet admission that the last plausible path to starving Britain had closed. U-boats would continue to fight in other theaters, but the decisive maritime front was lost. The war at sea had shifted from a contest that Germany might win to a delaying action in a conflict that was now structurally unwinnable. The deeper legacy of Black May lies in what it revealed about modern war. Technology, intelligence, organization, and production had converged into a single system that could sense, decide, and strike faster than an enemy bound to older doctrine could understand. The U-boat arm did not simply meet stronger escorts. It collided with the future of warfare and broke. In the end, the Atlantic did not belong to the side with the most daring captains. It belonged to the side that could see the shape of the next war while still fighting the present one.